I am finally getting to the Warden update, and today we're going to build the new Redline Warden in the Lord of the Rings Online and check out some of the new traits that they have from the Update 35 revamp. I suppose it's better late than never, but as we see my build here, I actually don't recommend really following this one. A lot of the traits that I have in particular in the yellow line were for testing purposes. But anyway, we will respec, and similar to my recent captain video, we're just going to look at how I go about building a character after they receive a pretty major rework. So notably, when we spec into the red line, we actually don't really get any abilities. We just get a little bit of a passive boost to our damage, attack duration, and actually have some nerfed healing from, in particular, our shield, spear, gambit line. With that out of the way, the first thing that we're going to want to pay attention to with the Warden is really just things that impact our damage over time, because that is our main source of damage. Also, I will go ahead and get this out of the way, but there is a ton of flexibility in how you end up choosing to build your Warden. So I'll go through some of the options and where certain traits might be useful in situations where the same traits might not be as useful depending what you are running. And if you happen to go in the range stance versus melee stance a lot. For example, for landscape content, I would probably be in assailment stance a lot more and choose traits in particular in the yellow line, as we'll get to, that are a little bit more impactful in the assailment stance compared to a pure group content DPS Warden, probably being a little bit more oriented towards just the melee spec. So with all that said, we'll go ahead and start off with just some of the new redline traits, and in the first row, we just have increased melee damage and increased bleed damage. Both of these traits, of course, would be useful, but if you find yourself never in melee, for example, that might not actually be worth picking because, hey, you'll only be doing range damage. Anyway, I will go ahead and pick both of these as they both will ultimately be useful, and again, we get more overall damage out of the melee stance because, well, you attack a lot faster, again, at the cost of not being ranged, really. And in the second row here, the left trait, Tempered Spear Tips, increases our bleed damage with our 3 primary bleed gambits. That is, of course, going to be very impactful for single target damage, so that's going to be quite useful. Physical Mastery is a trait that you only really need if you actually need the Physical Mastery stat, but at only 5 trait points that it costs, it's a very efficient way to get your Physical Mastery at level 140. This would be almost 100k just from this trait, so I'll go ahead and pick that as well. Now, here is where we start getting into some less useful traits, because with the Spear Gambit initial damage, a lot of your damage, even after the revamp, doesn't necessarily come from the initial damage of gambits. Just take Cauterizing Steel here, for example, and you can see actually without any trait spent that the range damage is quite horrible on that, but even for the melee damage, this is one of our strongest gambits in terms of upfront spear gambit damage, and it's still not that much. Now, of course, Cauterizing Steel in particular and its AoE variant with whatever that's called here, I'll have to build it up real quick, Unseen Strike. The big benefit of these is that they actually can consume your damage over time effects, and that does add a lot more value to them. But again, for just the initial damage, this is really hard to be worth picking right now, at least before we see alternatives, but it is something to keep in mind way later in the build. Next up here is light type damage, and a lot of our damage is going to be light type. That's going to be from a few of our different gambit lines. I do have a video on the new gambits if you're interested in that. That's why, unlike the captain video, I'm skipping over that. So I recommend that if you're a bit more lost with those, but light type damage is definitely useful. Now for morale tap damage, it's probably not going to be useful for a DPS build. You only have 3 morale taps really. That said, it is an option if you find it right for yourself, of course. Moving on to the next row, we have No Respite for the Wicked, and this one causes the gambits, and this will be the boot through Cauterizing Steel, which we just had up, which is going to be Spear Shield gambit line here. This will give an incoming healing debuff to the enemies that it impacts. It's 10%. And eventually at rank 3, you can stack that up to 3 times so you can get a 30% incoming healing debuff. The primary use of this would probably be in PvMP, but I honestly don't play that with my Warden. So if you already do that, you're probably more familiar if this would actually be useful, but at only 30% and having to stack it up 3 times, that's quite the significant cost to get that minor effect. Anyway, moving on with dot critical chance, well, that works perfectly with the Redline Warden, increased dot damage through crit chance. And hey, in the next row, it's basically the same thing, but damage instead of chance for your critical hits. So we'll definitely take that. And then second to last row here, we have Warden's Triumph, which actually is useful now. Notably, this does impact both Adroit Maneuver and Warden's Triumph, and it gives a huge increased duration of the buffs at rank 3. They last 30 seconds longer from these 2 gambits, and the magnitude of their effects is boosted quite significantly with Adroit Maneuver, of course, decreasing your attack duration so you can attack faster, and Warden's Triumph increasing your damage and eventually gives you an increased bleed pulse. So in short, I'll go ahead and pick that here and look at this next trait, which just gives us more pulses for our damage over time effects, so they do last longer. And having the Spear Gambit bleeds deal burst damage when they expire. It's not honestly the most impactful, but it is something that is decent with damage. And finally, in the last row, we have one of our strong offensive cooldowns here, which gives us quite the damage boost for 24-second duration here. You can almost have a third uptime with it, and it's just quite impactful, even a huge crit rating buff there. But anyway, the last trait here is muscle memory, and this one you really only want to pick if you have power issues. Now, playing DPS Warden, I have not run into too many power issues that I can't handle with something like the Dark Before Dawn, or just simply using power potions, so I will avoid picking this right now. That said, how it helps with power is that when you have a skill in battle memory, that will just restore a small amount of power. With my numbers, it is about 3% of my total power pool, which obviously is not a ton. But if you are running into power issues, it's only one trait point here. So at this point, we can go ahead and move to the set bonuses for the red line, which just increases our initial damage for Spear Gambit, so that's straightforward. Hey, more Gambit initial hit damage, all right. And then we do get a little bit of crit chance and crit damage. These are really straightforward so far. The first somewhat complicated one is just when you BPE an enemy. Rather, when an enemy BPEs you, block, parry, or evades you, then you will deal a little bit of damage to them, about 40,000, which isn't insignificant, but it's not all that much. And then the fifth set bonus here, guess what? It gives us even more initial damage for our Spear Gambits, but also when you defeat an enemy, you will get a little bit of a heal that does have a trigger limit of every 3 seconds. The second to last set bonus here is pretty similarly straightforward in that it just increases your damage, but it also gives you a little bit of an extra boost depending on your weapon. So you get a little bit of extra parry bonus from using a sword, which can be helpful. Notably, as a Redline Warden, you probably don't want to be relying on parries though. And then you also have inherent bleed damage from spears is a little bit better, triggering more frequently and dealing a bit more damage. If you are curious, it's actually a relatively decent amount of damage. It has a low apply chance, but you can see with my numbers here at level 140 again, that it's about 20,000 damage and you get 3 ticks of that ultimately. So at least it does give a little bit of an extra push to using a spear. And finally, the last trait here just increases our damage over time pulses by 1, also gives us a little bit of extra damage over time, and finally, of course, more initial skill damage, because why not? And alright, I know that was pretty rapid with the red line, but that's because a lot more of the interesting building options are in the yellow line now with the Warden. No matter if you are a red spec or a blue spec Warden, all that said, I do want to highlight one trait in the blue line that could be worth picking up. It will cost 10 trait points total to get all ranks in this, but you can increase your Fist Gambit damage, and again, a lot of your damage will come from your Fist Gambits, especially in AoE. So that is something to keep in mind, but I would recommend first looking at the yellow line because a lot of these are going to be cheaper and only require 1 trait point versus this requiring again 2 trait points for each rank. And again, here is actually where we get to some range damage options. So this is something I would actually recommend picking up if you are a leveling Warden on the landscape and actually do utilize your range stance. That is something that I use and you might have seen in some of the background gameplay. But for this character, I'll go ahead and hold off on that and see if there's something more universally useful, like light damage. This will impact you whether you are ranged or melee using light damage type gambits. So that's definitely going to be something we're going to want for DPS. The shield rating buffs for your shield gambits is basically useless for a red line Warden. Honestly, as a sneak preview for the next Warden video, not the most useful for a blue line Warden even. And then as we get into the right here is where we get marked, and in the second row it will be diminished target. These used to be 2 actual active javelin skills, but they are now tied to these 2 traits here. So if you use a gambit in the particular sequence here, boot through cauterizing steel, you will get the marked target debuff. And I did have to remind myself what marked target was, and that is indeed the physical mitigation debuff. So you see it decreases enemy physical mitigation by 7%, which is fairly significant, and that is something you would want to maintain, especially in longer fights. I realize it could be difficult in short landscape fights, but still at least worth putting 1 point in each of these to start. Now, getting the increased duration on both of these is pretty good quality of life, but we'll see if there's something more immediately impactful first. And then moving on here, we'll go ahead and check out finesse, which is pretty straightforward. If you need finesse, You can go ahead and put points in it. Up to 5 ranks, you can get 150,000, which is kind of insane. My character in this particular gear has some plenty of finesse, so I actually don't need any points on that. But again, that might vary for you, and especially while leveling or low levels, depending what gear you have, you could definitely need finesse, and it could be very valuable to pick up because you don't want enemies BPEing or resisting you. And while we're here, just very briefly, essentially the way that you can test if you need finesse is if an enemy BPE, block parry, evades you or resists you, then hey, you could use a little bit of finesse, and that's when you could consider trait points in this. Okay, so moving on, we have something that is a little bit more universally useful again, which is critical rating, and in particular, importantly, this gives you increased critical chance. On top of that, it does boost your ranged critical damage a little bit, but the universal crit chance is useful for all specs, or all stances rather, and we'll go ahead and put 5 points in that because that's very helpful. And finally, on the far left here is decreased attack duration, but very importantly, in the assailment stance only. It's not very clear about that, but it does indeed impact the assailment stance. So again, like the range damage, if you are finding yourself in the assailment stance and at range a lot, this could definitely be worth considering to very much so speed up your ranged gambits. And hey, the third trait here on this column is actually going to also impact our ranged warden. And this one just increases our javelin skill's maximum range. And just to confirm, this does also impact your ranged gambits, even though it says just javelin skills here, just to point that out. Also, that reminds me that I did forget to mention rank 6 in Bullseye is only really useful if you are also in range, because that last rank only gives you increased crit damage. And as a final reiteration before we move on, again, these 4 traits here can be quite useful if you are at range. This last one here with throwing arm is mainly a quality of life boost. It doesn't directly impact your damage, but if you want more range, I mean, it's there. That's what these traits are for. Moving on to battering strikes. This one's a bit odd because at rank 1, it gives you the debuff for the gambits in the offensive strike gambit line, so that goes through unseen strike here, your area of effect immediate damage gambits, and this gives a crit defense debuff to those. Now, honestly, the crit defense debuff is not that great at rank 1, but at rank 5 you can double the magnitude of that, and it's mainly going to be impactful in group content. If you're playing solo, this is honestly not going to have the biggest impact where you will really want it, unless you just find nothing better. So that is something that I will hold off on for now. And moving on to Strong Foundation, this one's actually very impactful because it reduces the cooldown of your gambit build or masteries, and these are you should be using as frequently as possible to build your gambit, so I'll immediately put 2 points in that. And then moving on for Enduring Assailment, this one increases the duration of our debuffs up to 20 seconds. Again, good quality of life boost, and that means you actually wouldn't have to use these gambits as much. Also, if you're wondering how I randomly got 5 points in Diminished Target, that was an accident there. And then here, if you are wondering what Suppression and maybe No Respite as a reminder is here in the red line and not the most useful. And then Battering Strikes we just covered, so up to 20 more seconds on that, which again would be nice quality of life boost. And then Suppression is actually a relatively useful one in that it is very easy to get this effect because it's in the Warcry through Desolation, so your AoE damage over time gambit sequence. And you use that so frequently that this is very easy to fulfill and actually get this debuff on enemies without interrupting maybe your regular rotation too much. So ultimately, this would be 5 trait points to increase the duration of Suppression if you do end up picking that, which as we'll get to, I do recommend. And if you do happen to have Battering Strikes, it would be that. It's something that I wouldn't prioritize over increasing the duration of something like Diminished Target and Mark Target to point out. And again, I will highlight that you can pick Finesse here or any of the ranged traits at this point. So for what I run on my Warden, at this point I'll go ahead and put some extra points in Mark Target and Diminished Target before we move on so I can actually unlock this next row. And as I already hinted at, Suppression's pretty useful, so I'll put trait points in that to get the decreased outgoing damage debuff on enemies. And then the leftmost trait here is just for your javelin abilities, and it just makes them less likely to be avoided or resisted, but you should have enough finesse where that should never be an issue. So if you are having issues with this, I would always recommend putting points in finesse instead and just ignoring this trait. Moving on for Javelin of Deadly Force, this is actually a very exciting active ability for us to get. It's a 1 minute cooldown, but it's a 13 target AoE here that might be impacted by some of my ally slide tracers, so perhaps ignore that exact number. But this one actually applies the, let's see, marked and diminished target debuff to any enemy hit by it. On a 1 minute cooldown, you can see actually how the marked and diminished target debuffs at default lasting 30 seconds, you can't have full uptime on that. There we go. I suppose applying the traits would actually show the debuff, but you see it's 35 seconds here, but if you get the full duration on that, it will actually be the full minute. You can even see with the tooltip here that it is impacted by the debuff durations for these. So in short, that is definitely worth getting. And then the rightmost trait here makes Adroit Maneuver actually give you a self buff that makes your next ambush have no induction. The main benefit of this is you can get an instant in combat stun on an enemy. On top of that, ambush does increase your run speed by quite a bit for a short duration, so it can be useful for that if you need to quickly stun an enemy and run away from them if you actually use Adroit Maneuver first. This does cost 2 trait points and it has some general utility, but it doesn't directly impact your damage, so it's just one of those traits that's flexible and up to you if you want that effect. It is definitely not completely useless though. All that said, at this point I'll go ahead and put some trait points to increase marked target and diminished target. We'll go ahead and get them both up to 4. Eventually we'll probably want to get them to 5, but just being a little bit cautious with our trait points right now, which we do have plenty. Anyway, in the second to last row here, Fire at Will is a fellowship-wide buff that increases range damage and tactical damage by 5%, and importantly also decreases attack duration. So this does impact you even if you're in the melee stance, and like everybody in your fellowship, even if they're not ranged or tactical, just not quite as much. Of course this is going to be useful, but it has relatively low uptime by about 15-ish%, a 1 out of 6 uptime. So just keep in mind the duration of this is very short and it's not even the most significant buff, but it is something that directly impacts our damage and seems more universally appealing than some of these previous traits, especially if you are running group content. If you aren't running group content, honestly it's a little bit more debatable because of the short duration and only impacting range damage on top of the relatively small attack duration buff. Perhaps as a recommendation, if you are interested in something different, could be a good time to consider Warcry for a little bit useful universal, again, damage boost to fist gambits. Either way, the other trait that's actually in the Javelin of Deadly Force branch, probably should have started with this. Basically, your gambit builders have a chance to reset your Javelin skill cooldown, which does include Javelin of Deadly Force, and that is pretty useful. That will help make sure, especially in AoE situations, that you can keep the marked and diminished target debuffs up, and even in single target if you happen to lose that, or even miss your target with Javelin of Deadly Force, because that's a definite possibility with how it works in LOTRO. Then yeah, I forgot where I was going with that, but basically it's useful. So we still need to spend some trait points to get to the bottom row here, and we'll put 1 point in each of those, and there we go. We perfectly have it unlocked for Rapid Techniques, which is of course very useful. A 1.5-minute cooldown that allows you for only 6 seconds though to use your masteries without any cooldown, but for those 6 seconds that's very impactful. It allows you to very rapidly build up gambits. And at this point we have completed what I consider the baseline Red Warden build with update 35, at least how I'm currently building it. Again, this isn't a full in-depth guide video, but just my process for building the Warden in the revamp. With 15 trait points, you have quite a lot of options for what you want to pick. If you want to have battering strikes and maybe don't have another Warden in your group and can actually maintain this and keep up the crit defense debuff, then that could definitely be worth the 5 trait points. Again, if you do any range combat, then all 3 of these traits could potentially be useful. I'd recommend starting out with just the damage ones. And again, some quality of life things with something like Enduring Assailment, and if you need Finesse, just point that out again, and also Adroit Ambush if you want that effect. Anyway, for the purposes of this character, I'm going to go ahead and pick up Warcry for its universal effectiveness there. There's not really much else in the blue line that would be particularly useful. Defiant Challenge you could kind of consider for the reflect damage. It's not completely negligible, but you might be able to find some other better options, but thought I would point that out. Now for my 5 other trait points, I think I'll just go ahead and get straight up range damage, because I actually do end up going in the range stance a decent bit on landscape content, even though at this point it's mostly group content. I might actually reevaluate this build just for update 35 King's Gondor coming out, update 36 rather, where on the landscape I'll probably pick more range traits and perhaps get rid of the fist gambit damage, go ahead and put 5 points in endurance training and throwing arm instead, instead, might also even get rid of the melee gambit damage and just see how things shake out with that. Again, the great thing about the L line being a utility tree that just supplements the red and blue line warden builds is that you do have all this flexibility, and that is again one of the things that I was hoping to break down in this video, as well as again just how I build the red line warden now. And on that note, I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something useful about building the red line warden and the process that goes along with that. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching, everyone.